and we're going to do this together. So first I'm going to read it to myself. Archie was too far gone to make a big noise about it, but he watched them with a warm internal smile as they deposited their load, streaking white walls purple. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my highlighter out and look for any adjectives. All right, so now I see some things that are standing out to me from my last sentence. So again, we're using this comma at the end to define something and describe it. So streaking white walls purple. So that is a descriptor of them depositing their load. So when we think just about this sentence and we don't think about the one before it, this sentence isn't giving us much information. So another descriptor here is Archie was too far gone. So we're talking about Archie. And they're saying he was too far gone. Now, without any prior information, we're not 100% sure what that means, but it's interesting and we have a question about it. What do you mean he's too far gone? What has he been doing? We don't know, but it's something to consider when we're analyzing the text. So he's too far gone to make a big noise about it. So this is an interesting way that they worded this, and to make a big noise about it. So thinking about this sentence, was too far gone and to make a big noise about it, we're thinking, okay, he was too far gone, so maybe we could say maybe he was asleep, maybe he was drinking, and he's not coherent enough to make any noise about it, because as we remember, our hashtag from this one, our hashtag from the first sentence is, our hashtag from the first sentence is hashtag almost attacked, but not. So when we know that that was the summary from the first sentence, we can think, okay, to make a big noise about it. So if you're almost attacked by a bird, you might scream, yell, jump, but since he was too far gone, he wasn't able to make a noise about it. Although this is an interesting choice of wording, the way that he worded it. So that's something to consider also. Why would he choose that wording? Why is that described that way? Moving on, but he watched them with a warm internal smile. So this is another interesting part. So I'm going to highlight it in blue. Warm internal smile. So this is also, in a sense, imagery when you think about it, because the author is using this warm internal smile, and it's having us imagine what this warm internal smile is. It's very specific descriptors. Even though we may not know what a warm internal smile looks like, it's also telling us more about the character and their mind frame. So Archie is essentially watching these vultures or birds attacking dead animals because it's at, remember, a butcher's. They stopped at a butcher's. So we can only imagine that they are taking dead animals with them in their mouths, and they're just depositing, as he said, depositing their load, which their load is referring to the dead animals that they got from the butchers. And he is smiling about it. He has an internal smile watching this goriness happen. So that tells us a little bit about Archie. Maybe Archie is more cynical, or maybe Archie is a little sadistic and this grotesque display is laughable to him. Or maybe he has seen worse. And that's a little bit of foreshadowing into Archie's past. So the next thing is, as they deposit their load, which as we have described earlier is dead animals, streaking white walls purple. So this is another interesting thing. The author said streaking white walls purple. And this is also an example of imagery, because it's having us imagine these dead, skinned, gory animals that have been essentially butchered, being picked apart by these vultures and being thrown or smeared across a wall. And it's causing purple marks on the white wall. So that's another use of alert advice to create imagery, which is helping us visualize what Archie is seeing. And the last thing we have to do, of course, is come up with a hashtag for this quote. So let's read it again with all we know. Archie was too far gone to make a big noise about it, but he watched them with a warm internal smile as they deposited their load, streaking white walls purple. So I think for this, I'm going to give it the hashtag, blood art. And that will help me remember that in this sentence, Archie is watching these animals spray purple blood on the white walls. and his warm internal smile. If I want to, I could even put a semicolon and a parenthesis to stress that internal smile and remind myself of that. All right, on to the next sentence then. Okay, on to the third sentence. So, he watched them stretch their peering bird heads over the Hussein Ishmael gutter. He watched them watch the slow and steady draining of blood from the dead things, chickens, cows, sheep, hanging on their hooks like coats around the shop. All right, so right away from that, from the first time I read it, I immediately noticed the simile. So I'm going to highlight it. Hanging on their hooks like coats around the shop. And we'll come back to analyze it further. All right, so now starting from the beginning. He watched them stretch their peering bird heads. I find that interesting again. It is similar with the other wording, but bird heads is an interesting choice of words. The author could have said he watched them stretch their peering heads, but the importance of the bird heads is kind of interesting, a new wording. We wouldn't really refer to a bird head as a bird's head, the head of a bird. So that's interesting, something to take note of. Additionally, we can also go through here and say, well, peering, that's a descriptor of the bird's heads. So that's something to note. Additionally, if we wanted to go through and notice the verbs, we could say for sure, we watch them stretch, that's the verb for they're stretching their bird's heads over this gutter. So that's the end of that. And then if we're also realizing all the punctuation, we have a semicolon here. So we can also think about sentence structure. So he watched them stretch their peering birds' heads over the Hussein Ishmael gutter. So that could be a sentence of itself. So that's definitely independent. And then the second part, he watched them watch the slow and steady draining of blood from the dead things. Chickens, cows, sheep. That could also be a sentence. So there's two independent sentences in here. This is actually, the second part is probably describing what was happening during this. When you think about it, he watched them stretch their peering bird heads over the Ishmael gutter. He watched them watch the slow and steady draining of blood from the dead things, chicken, cows, sheep, hanging their hooks like coats around the shop. Interesting. That's an interesting descriptor. This second independent sentence is extremely descriptive, so that's also something to understand. And this first one is very simple and not very complex. So he watched them watch the slow and steady. So here are more descriptors. Let's go with this color. So slow and steady. So these are definitely helping us with our imagery. We're watching the slow and steady draining of blood. So those are definitely some gory imagery. Draining of blood from the dead things. So here's another important part because, this is another important aspect. So from the dead things. So here the author is telling us that there are dead things. So if we went back to the first sentence, if we weren't sure what butchers had at their shop or if what the vultures had taken and were smearing on the walls, this third sentence informs us of that. We now know that it was dead things that were being smeared on the walls, and that's why it was purple. So it's also helpful if we aren't sure what the sentence before it is saying, this sentence is clarifying that for us by stating this subject of dead things. All right, so moving on, here's another dash that we have, chickens, cows, and sheep. So this dash is actually used to give examples. So dead things, what dead things are we talking about? Dash, cat, chickens, cows, sheep. Those are the kind of animals that we're seeing. And there's the other dash that then continues. And it's important to realize that these dashes can also be substituted as commas. So if we put a comma here and a comma here, then this chickens, cows, sheep is an unnecessary sentence per se or clause because it is able to be taken out and the sentence still makes sense. From the dead things, hanging their hooks like coats around the shop. This is just extra information for us. So we may know, and also it helps with the imagery because now we know exactly what animals that the author is talking about. We know exactly what animals are being smeared across the walls. So, hanging on their hooks like coats around the shop. So, let's analyze this simile. So, hanging on their hooks, and then here's our like that tells us it's a simile, coats around the shop. So, this is describing how the animal carcasses seem to be hanging, and the blood is dripping out of them and draining from them, similar to the way that coats are hung in shops. So this can help you draw a connection to maybe if you've ever had an animal skin, or maybe an animal coat that's a carpet now or a rug. That is essentially, they're trying to get us to an imagery of relating how coats hang on racks to an animal draining of blood being hung and what he's watching, what Archie is seeing. Because he's watching them as they are, this is another important thing, he's watching them as they are watching the slow and steady draining blood of the dead things, hanging on their hooks. So we could also think, all right, considering that the animals are chickens, cows, and sheep, and these birds might not, I mean, birds aren't that big, it's important to think, okay, so in a butcher shop, these animals are hanging on hooks, so that's important to be able to know. That might be prior knowledge, or it might be something that you don't know, but that's what he's referring to. He's referring to the animals that are still on the hooks. So these animals aren't being carried by the birds, per se. They are being currently picked upon, and he's watching as they're hanging on their hooks in the butchery, outside the butchery, and dripping blood, and the animals are watching as well. So that's a helpful connection, is if you know what the hooks look like that hold the animals, and then coats around the shop can be, this might be a relatively older reference, but we can imagine if we break it down, coats, and then if you go to a shop or a restaurant, they'll have a coat hanger, and just imagine any kind of coat hanging, and that's what they're comparing it to. So before we finish this sentence, the important thing is to come up with a hashtag that summarizes it. So maybe we need to read it again to be sure we know what's going on. He watched them stretch their peering bird heads over the hussing Ishmael gutter. He watched them watch the slow and steady draining of blood from the dead things, chickens, cows, sheep, hanging on their hooks like coats around the shop. So I'm thinking that for my summary of this, I'm going to say draining coats. Now, this may not make sense to anybody else, but your summaries are for yourself to remind you of what the sentence is about. So for me, when I think of draining coats, it doesn't really make sense, but it will remind me of the simile that I read and analyzed, and how it was comparing the animals that are hanging in the draining blood to how coats are hung on a rack. All right, on to the next sentence.